Now lately I came across an interesting article, namely why Europe conquered the world.
Now to clarify what I mean with conquered, here a quote. Sooner or later, almost every territory in the world outside of Europe itself suffered one or more of the following fates. Number 1. Its indigenous population was replaced by European immigrants, for instance North America, Argentina. Number 2. Its indigenous population was ruled by European officials, for instance Zaire and India. Number 3. It was divided into spheres of influence by European powers, for instance Iran and China. Or number 4, it was left as a buffer zone between rival European powers, for instance Afghanistan, Thailand.
Now this of course is related to the development of firearms, naval power and forts. So why is this so important? So with naval power you control a lot of the trading. This is still valid today, as pointed out in my video about the US Navy and the Chinese Navy. And of course if you have certain fortifications to defend your ports, your important trading points, with firepower, cannons and guns and muskets, you can defend them rather easily and also quite cheaply while still holding an important position somewhere in the world. So it's to a large degree about firearms. Now the issue here is, yet firearms were not unique to Europe at all. Actually the Chinese were about the first to invent them at around 1100. Additionally, if you look at the situation, if you look at tactics and everything, the Europeans were neither the leaders. For instance, the Japanese developed volley fire before the Europeans did about 20 years before. So why, in the end, were the Europeans so leading in firearms development and then were able to conquer the world, or whatever you want to call it? So what was going on? And there are several factors at hand. Some point out, yeah, there was a constant war and there were competitive markets. But if you look at this, if you look at other areas in the world, usually these factors are also given. So what else was going on? Why was it not the Chinese? Why not the Japanese? Why not the Ottomans? Why not somebody in India? Or why not the Russians? So let's look at them specifically. First, let's look at the Chinese because, well, they invented firearms. So if we look at the situation, okay, was the constant warfare factor fulfilled in China? And at first you go, yes. And then if you look closer, you kind of go, actually no. Why? Because the devil is in the detail here and it comes down to technology and what works and what not. So from 1500 to 1799, about 56% of the times the Chinese were at war, which is similar to Europe. Yet, if we look whom they were fighting, we notice that for the most part they were fighting nomads. And only for 3% of these wars were against non-nomads. So what is it with nomads and firearms? Simply put, early firearms against nomads suck. That's it. So nomads usually have bows, they have a higher rate of fire and also higher accuracy. And the issue is they are usually cavalry and they fight more or less dispersed or can easily disperse. Additionally, they usually don't have cities. What does this mean? Early firearms were very limited in their usage. They were not effective against a lot. They were not effective against individual targets. So riders that disperse, they were mostly effective against infantry formations, close order formations. Then they worked rather well, and they were also great siege weapons. Oh well, not great, but good siege weapons. Nomads don't have cities to besiege, and their cavalry archers and everything outmoves your guys with the guns and everything. As a result, firearms were not effective against nomads or against large cavalry forces in general, and so there was not a real incentive to invest into them, or it didn't make much sense from the warfaring capabilities. Now, there was another issue with China, which is similar to Japan, so let's look at Japan next. As mentioned before, they developed volley fire before the Europeans, from far what we know. Now, of course, somebody will now bring up the Japanese banned firearms. This is the reason nothing happened there. And basically every author I read on this explicitly point out, no, this is a myth. This is not true. This is wrong. There was no cultural banning of firearms. There were certain restrictions, but it was not a ban or nothing on this. Actually, there was quite a heavy focus on gunpowder technology. What actually happened is the Japanese, unlike in the Second World War, ran out of wars. So it was unified under the Tokugawa shogunate from 1603 to 1867. And since Japan is a rather large island, not much was going on. Of course, as somebody will point out, but they invaded Korea. Yeah, but this was one leader or several leaders and then they didn't follow up. So you had this issue that there was not much war going on and not really an incentive to invest a lot in gunpowder technology or anything else on the side. And this is similar to China, which also was unified at certain points. And this is another interesting aspect. If we look at Europe, you usually don't have large empires at this time. You have smaller ones, or you have smaller nation states, not empires. And these are fighting all the time. And this is, some authors point out, this is more or less an anomaly, which only happened in Europe, the nation state, because you had city-states for some time and you had large empires. But the nation-state thingy that was going on in Europe was rather uncommon for the restern parts of the world. And this to a certain degree drove to a constant competitive or constant warfare. So which brings us to another major empire, the Ottoman Empire. Now here, of course, some will already know, they had a strong cavalry focus. So guns were rather unsuited. The thing is, for reloading a musket, the early weapons, it was extensive. You couldn't do this on a horse. You couldn't do this mounted because these were extremely long and the technique and everything. So you can't reload on a horseback. So firearms, again, make mostly sense with infantry. Now to give you some number on how much cavalry the Ottomans had, in the 18th century around 77%, whereas France had about 27%. As you can see, almost 30% and the other almost 80%. So quite a huge disparity here. Another major problem was that they had to spend a lot of money in guerrilla warfare. And also tax efficiency was rather low. They could not put as much money into research as other countries or other empires could do. So not enough money, heavy cavalry focus, so less incentive to invest in firearms in general and also not enough money there. Now let's look at one of the main enemies of the Ottomans. And here we have the Russians. They had a similar problem. Early on they fought mostly nomads. So till the mid-17th century they fought against the Tatars. And since the main enemy were the Ottomans, and as mentioned before, they have a lot of cavalry, firearms were also not particularly well suited here. And similarly to the Ottomans, they also had to spend a lot of money in guerrilla warfare. Yet, unlike the Ottomans, the Russians caught up. Very important here is Peter the Great. He brings experts in from Europe and reforms his country and everything. Another interesting aspect he does, he introduces serfdom, which reduces the cost for conscripts. So what does this mean in economical terms? He reduces the average cost of waging war because we have cheaper infantry or cheaper soldiers. And due to these various changes and effects, in the 18th century, Russia becomes a great power and joins up, quite contrary to the Ottomans, which basically decrease in their importance over time. So let's look at the last area, basically India. Now here there are competitive markets and there's also regular warfare. And additionally there's constant tech and tactics improvement. But overall, the innovation seems to be limited from all what we know. What was going on? Again, a heavy cavalry focus till the 18th century. And we don't have tax data here, but it seems that generally the rulers there had a hard time of acquiring or getting the resources out of the area. So limited tax efficiency was very likely. As a result, wars were less profitable than in Europe, and less money could be spent on constant development of weapons and firearms. And one author brings an interesting point up here about the East India Company, because they had a rather low average cost for mobilizing troops in contrast to India. And what they could do does fight the high cost Indian troops with their rather low cost units. And also what they did initially, that they conquered very important high tax areas and also likely had a better tax efficiency. Now to conclude, one of the major factors is constant warfare. What helps with constant warfare? You don't have a unified empire like the Japanese. So nation state in this aspect helps. So a rather small area. If you look at Europe in a properly proportioned map, you see it's rather small with a rather high density of population, which basically favors warfare to a certain degree. Of course, you also need to fight the right enemy. Against cavalry, especially nomads, firearms are not particularly effective. Yet if you're fighting mainly infantry, this works out well. Also for siege warfare, early firearms are quite effective as well. Another aspect is you need the ability for constant innovation. This means there's a certain amount of money there on the markets, but you also need a certain amount of tax efficiency to extract the money or other resources out of your area. So this needs proper economy and also sometimes proper administration. Additionally now, warfare must be profitable enough. So the average cost for waging a war must be rather low, whereas the benefit of winning a war must be rather high. And these were all factors that were given for the most parts of Europe. As such, a lot of money flew into the development of firearms. Now, another interesting aspect one author points out, that you can't actually really ban technology in Europe at this point in time because you have so many different factions. And since they are mostly hostile to each other to a certain degree, if you ban, for instance, a certain weapon or a certain research or something, they likely move somewhere else. Especially since the distances are rather small as well. So there's also the inhibition against, or the banning of research and innovation is way too limited. Another aspect not necessarily pointed out by these authors, but pointed out by several authors about the Stoßtrupp-Taktik, the stormtrooper tactics of the Germans in World War I, that a lot of cross-fertilization is going on. So every side learns from the other and adapts. At this point it's probably more limited, but it's still going on. If somebody has a tactical edge or a technological edge, it only takes a certain amount of time till the others catch up usually, because you see what happens and then you kind of react. So in long times of peace it can't really happen more if there's long distances. But if there's a constant struggle going on, there's a constant learning involved. So I hope you learned something new. Big thank you here to Jack for sending me Waging War, War in Human Civilization and Firearms, a Global History. These books helped tremendously in making this video. Thank you for watching and see you next time.